Hey guys. Tonight was starting with something warm, simple, and very ancient. So if you're settling into bed, maybe with a cup of something cozy, you can just let your shoulders drop. Because we're not jumping into battles or curses or pharaoh-level drama. No, tonight we're going straight into carbs. Before pyramids, before mummy movies, before overly dramatic archaeologists running around, there was breakfast. And in ancient Egypt, breakfast was basically the cornerstone of civilization. And the person making it? Yeah, that overworked, grain-dusted baker whose entire life revolved around grinding, kneading, sweating, praying, and trying very hard not to get sand in literally everything. So let's drift into the world of the ancient Egyptian baker. Slow, calm, and a little snarky. Because honestly, these people lived inside a clay oven disguised as a country. Take a deep breath. Let's drift back 4,000 years. It's a little before sunrise, which feels rude, but this is ancient Egypt. People start work early, and gods forbid anyone gets to sleep in. We're floating over a mud brick house in a dusty village near the Nile. The river hasn't flooded yet this season, so everything looks a bit dry and crunchy, which is fun because that's also the exact texture of the bread we're about to make. And below us is our baker, the most essential, unsung hero of the entire kingdom. Because it turns out that no matter what age of human history you visit, everyone is cranky without carbs. He's already awake. Of course he is. Bakers always are. It's basically the first known universal human profession built on sleep deprivation. He stretches a little, he scratches his arms, and then he trudges over to the grinding slab. Because breakfast in ancient Egypt starts with manual labor that makes CrossFit look like a nap. The ritual of grinding emmer wheat. Our baker kneels in front of two large stones, the saddle quern on the bottom and the handstone on top. Classic gear. If you ever want to feel exceptionally grateful for modern life, just imagine grinding grain for 6 hours a day using only your own spine and hopes. Emmer wheat sits there in little piles, looking very innocent. It isn't. It's stubborn, it's coarse, and it's full of chaff that absolutely will not leave your clothing until at least the next dynasty. He pours a handful onto the slab, he leans forward, and he begins that rhythmic back-and-forth motion that every Egyptian baker knew a little too well. The sound is soft, stone brushing stone, grain cracking under pressure, a powdery whispering that fills the room. It's almost soothing, if you ignore the part where your kneecaps are slowly turning into gravel. Like most working Egyptians, our baker isn't alone. There might be a few family members helping, or apprentices, or just another unlucky villager drafted into grain duty. Grinding grain wasn't a cute rustic hobby. It was daily, mandatory, sweat-dripping survival. This is the slow, monotonous heartbeat of the morning. And yes, before you ask, there is sand in the wheat. Because of course there is. This is Egypt. Sand gets everywhere. It is the national seasoning. You'll hear modern archaeologists talk about Egyptian bread wearing down teeth, and this is exactly why. You're basically eating mineral supplement bread. Crunchy calcium surprise. Delicious. And despite all that, this grain is sacred. The Egyptians saw bread as a literal divine gift. Bread came from the Nile's flood, which was orchestrated by the gods, which meant every loaf was kind of a holy object. Not that anyone said that while chewing on sand bread, but spiritually, yes, divine. Lighting the clay oven, also known as the daily sauna session. Once enough flour is ready, our baker stands up, slowly, because his spine has decided to file an official complaint, and moves towards the bakery area. It's usually outdoors or semi-outdoors, an open courtyard, a shaded corner, or just wherever a clay oven fits without catching the house on fire. Fire safety wasn't exactly a profession back then. Egyptian ovens are beautiful in a brutal sort of way. They're clay, dome-shaped, narrow at the top, wider at the base, basically giant, aggressive pottery pieces that happen to cook things. And the only way to use them is to get them very hot. First, he loads in fuel, mostly dried dung, chopped reeds, or whatever the environment provides. Wood is rare here. Trees were basically celebrities. You didn't waste them on breakfast. He lights the fire, and instantly the courtyard fills with that thick, earthy smoke that clings to your nostrils and would definitely get your neighbors calling the fire department today. But here, totally normal. Smells like another productive morning. The oven begins to glow warm, then hotter, then uncomfortably hot. Our baker wipes his forehead with the part of his tunic that isn't already dusty. Spoiler, it's all dusty. And while the oven heats, he mixes the dough. Flour, water, maybe a bit of leftover sourdoughish starter, but don't romanticize it. Egyptian yeast is basically wild, chaotic microbe energy. Nothing artisanal about it. Doughs could be inconsistent, sticky, or a little too wet, but when your audience is a hungry farming village, no one's leaving a review. He kneads it by hand, pressing and folding, breathing slowly as he works. There's a rhythm to this too. Egyptian bread was often shaped into cones, rounds, or little loaves that look suspiciously like cylinders of modeling clay. He lines them up on a tray or just piles them near the oven entrance, ready to bake. Morning offerings, because even bread needs to impress the gods. Now, here's the thing. Ancient Egyptian bakers aren't just making food, they're making offerings. Bread was the go-to gift for literally every deity on the roster. Osiris, bread. Hathor, bread. Amun, bread again. Even minor gods probably had a stack of spiritual baked goods waiting for them. So our baker sets aside a few particularly neat loaves. These aren't for customers. These are for the gods. And he gives a small bow, maybe a muttered prayer, because the Egyptians didn't separate the sacred from the everyday. Baking wasn't just domestic work, it was a spiritual duty. This is the part where modern viewers tend to imagine the baker as some solemn temple employee wearing pristine linen. No, he's barefoot, sweaty, and has dough stuck to his elbow, but he's still honoring divine tradition. The gods weren't picky. Slipping the bread into the oven, carefully, calmly, and with a 100% chance of burns. The oven is ready now, radiating enough heat to bake the bread and your soul at the same time. Egyptian bakers used long wooden paddles, clay tiles, or sometimes just their own hands wrapped in damp cloth. OSHA would not approve. He leans in, places each loaf quickly, and steps back. Heat rushes at his face. His eyelashes feel like they're questioning their life choices. But it's fine. This is daily life. The loaves begin to firm up almost immediately. The outer crust sets into that iconic hard shell that makes ancient bread look like something you'd use to build a wall. While the bread bakes, he tidies up a bit, sweeps grain dust into little piles, rubs flour off his arms, coughs out a bit of smoke. Maybe he chats with someone nearby about the Nile or the cows, or how this summer's heat is exactly as unpleasant as everyone expected. Conversations in ancient Egypt were probably very weather-themed. And through all of this, he moves slow and steady. The morning is long. The day is longer. No one is rushing. In a culture where almost everything depended on predictable cycles, the river, the seasons, the harvest, life had its own sleepy tempo. Sand, sand, and more sand. A good time now to mention the constant villain in this story. Sand. It's on the floor, it's in the air, it's definitely part of the bread at this point. Our baker doesn't even notice anymore. He's numb to the sand. His customers are numb to the sand. Their molars, however, are actively being eroded into oblivion, which is why ancient mummies have fabulous hair and terrible teeth. But hey, no gluten-free diets here. The ancient world wasn't ready. Mid-morning calm, bread aroma, and quiet duties. Eventually, the bread finishes baking.
If you're still drifting toward sleep, just stay right where you are. You don't need to adjust anything. We're just gliding gently from a dusty village bakery into the slow, regal orbit of one of Egypt's most quietly unstoppable figures. Because if there was ever a queen who understood food, stability, and the art of keeping a kingdom fed without making a big show about it, it was Hatshepsut, a woman whose entire reign basically said, let's not start any wars. Let's build things. Let's grow things. Let's keep everyone alive and reasonably content. Honestly, goals. So let's float down into the warm sunlight of the 15th century BCE. Thebes shimmering like a mirage, the scent of incense drifting out of temples, and one queen who somehow managed to run Egypt like a calm, competent project manager with amazing architectural skills. No big deal. Morning in the palace, linen, incense, and bureaucracy. The first thing you need to know about Hatshepsut's world is that it moved slowly. Palace mornings weren't high-energy political wrestling matches. They were quiet, steady, ceremonial. The kind of workflow you'd get if your job was half religious ritual, half governance, and half making sure the gods didn't think you were ignoring them. Yes, that's 3 halves. Ancient Egyptian rulers didn't really do normal math. So imagine Hatshepsut waking up in a cool, shadowed chamber, well, cooler by Egyptian standards, draped in linen finer than anything her citizens could dream of. Servants pour water from polished stone jars. Attendants bring oils. Priests murmur morning blessings. The palace cat probably judges everyone in the room. Everything is gentle, slow, repetitive, predictable. Just how she liked it. Because no matter what her official titles said, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the 2 lands, all that grandeur, Hatshepsut's real power came from keeping the national pulse steady, from maintaining grain flow, from giving farmers stability, from preventing chaos in a world where a single bad Nile flood could turn everything into a disaster. She wasn't a conqueror. She wasn't building an empire of bloodshed. She was building, well, an actual empire, the sustainable kind. And it all began with food. Hatshepsut's rise, a very calm power grab. Let's talk about how she even got to the throne. And don't worry, this isn't Game of Thrones. There are no dragons, no shock betrayals, and absolutely no climactic battles. Just a series of very reasonable decisions that somehow ended with a woman wearing the royal beard. Hatshepsut was born royal, daughter of Thutmose I,
married to her half-brother Thutmose II, because of course she was. Egyptian dynasties loved keeping the family tree so tight it practically choked itself. But whatever, this was normal. When her husband died early, he was the pharaoh, so not exactly living the stress-free lifestyle. His heir was Thutmose III, a child, a very small child. And Egypt needed someone who could wake up in the morning without needing help tying their sandals. So Hatshepsut stepped in as regent. Perfectly normal, perfectly legal. But then she slowly expanded her role. She took on more ceremonial duties, more titles, more visibility. And one day she basically said, "Listen, technically I'm running the country anyway," and she became pharaoh. Not queen consort, not queen regent. Pharaoh. The highest title, the big hat, the divine job description. And she did it so smoothly that no one was really sure when exactly the transition happened. It was like she upgraded herself quietly, without dramatic announcements, like a software update that just appears one morning and politely informs you it fixed 10 things you didn't know were broken. Agriculture under Hatshepsut, the real secret to power. While other rulers often focused on conquering neighbors or building giant ego monuments, Hatshepsut did something even more threatening. She made the economy steady. Under her reign, agriculture thrived, and in Egypt, agriculture meant everything. She improved irrigation. She protected trade routes. She strengthened temple estates that managed storage and distribution. Basically, she kept the grain flowing, which kept the bread baking, which kept the workers building, which kept the gods satisfied, which kept the kingdom stable. A perfect loop of very sensible policies. And you know who especially appreciated all this? Bakers, farmers, scribes, everyone whose daily work depended on predictable harvests and not starving. There's a quiet, almost maternal quality to her reign. It has none of that aggressive, chest-thumping leadership. Instead, it feels like she was balancing spinning plates while humming softly and telling everyone to calm down. She didn't make Egypt richer through conquest. She made Egypt richer through competency, which historically is much rarer. The religious side, feeding the gods to feed the people. Now, here's the part that ties beautifully into our theme, food and the sacred. Egyptian religion was intensely agricultural. The Nile flood was both a miracle and a spreadsheet event. Grain wasn't just a crop, it was a cosmic cycle. Bread wasn't just food, it was spiritual currency. And Hatshepsut understood this intuitively. She strengthened cults tied to fertility and harvest. She expanded temple estates that managed granaries. She made offerings central to royal imagery. You'll see her in carved reliefs holding bread, pouring libations, presenting gifts to deities in scenes that feel very domestic for a monarch. It's almost cozy. She treats the gods less like distant cosmic entities and more like demanding relatives who need consistent snacks to stay friendly. The message was clear. If the gods eat well, the people eat well. If the gods are honored, the Nile behaves. If the Nile behaves, Egypt thrives. It's a lovely circular logic, and strangely comforting. The Punt expedition. Let's get some fancy trees. Now, normally I wouldn't mention expeditions in a sleepy monologue, but don't worry, this one isn't exciting. It's botanical. Hatshepsut organized a major expedition to the land of Punt, somewhere near the Horn of Africa, to acquire incense, myrrh, and most famously, trees. Yes, she shipped entire trees back to Egypt. Not exactly a war story. The journey is depicted in reliefs at her mortuary temple. Sailors pushing boats, people carrying goods, exotic animals wandering around, but everything feels surprisingly calm, like the ancient equivalent of a National Geographic episode narrated by someone who just woke up from a nap. And when the expedition returned, Egypt celebrated, not with battle triumphs, but with incense burning in temples, with offerings, with plenty of grain-funded feasting. Because a peaceful trade mission that brought back luxury plants was somehow more impressive than conquering a neighbor. Hatshepsut loved prosperity, quiet, agricultural prosperity. Her reign is basically a long, steady inhale. No sharp exhales. The architecture. Big monuments. Soft energy. Even if you've never studied Hatshepsut, you've seen her architectural masterpiece, Deir el-Bahri, her mortuary temple. But here's the thing. While the building is massive, it's not loud. Its design is all about horizontals, terraces, repeating patterns. It feels calm, layered.
If you're already half asleep, perfect. This section is basically designed for that slow drift where history stops feeling like dates and turns into a warm blur of stone walls, flickering lamps, and archaeologists quietly losing their minds over crumbs. Because ancient Egypt didn't just bake for breakfast. They baked for eternity. And honestly, if you've ever loved a carb enough to wish it followed you into the afterlife, the Egyptians understood you on a spiritual level. So let's glide softly downward underground, into the tombs, the carvings, the offering chambers, where bread was more than food. It was memory. It was ritual. It was a cosmic snack pack meant to keep your soul comfortable forever. No rush. We're drifting slowly, like dust settling in a long, sealed hallway. Descending into the tomb, stone, silence, and the scent of old offerings. Imagine stepping into a tomb thousands of years ago, not as an intruder, not as an archaeologist, just as someone in the ancient world carrying offerings for a recently departed loved one. The air would be cool, a little damp, thick with the smell of earth and old incense. Torches flicker, shadows stretch along carved walls, and everywhere, scenes of baking. Yes, baking. Because the Egyptians believed that the afterlife wasn't some abstract dream, it was a continuation of life, just with fewer chores and better landscaping. And if you wanted to stay alive in the afterworld, you needed bread. Lots of it. Preferably shaped exactly like the bread you ate while living. So naturally, they decorated tombs with endless carvings of bakers grinding grain, kneading dough, stoking fires, shaping loaves, arranging offerings. These weren't artistic flourishes. They were magical instructions. Depict something in a tomb, and it becomes eternally available. It's like cosmic room service. You carve a baker, and suddenly the afterlife staff has unlimited carbs. Kind of brilliant. The tomb ovens. Eternal appliances for eternal meals. A lot of people imagine tombs as empty stone rooms with sarcophagi, but many of them were filled with full-scale replicas of daily life, including ovens. Not working ovens, of course. No one is lighting fires underground, but clay models of ovens. miniature bakeries, little pottery replicas of grain bins and kneading troughs. And sometimes, this is my favorite part, they included bread itself, actual bread. Real loaves that survived for thousands of years because Egypt is basically one giant natural dehydrator. Think about that. Somewhere in a museum drawer, there is a loaf of bread older than every empire you've ever learned about. It looks like something someone left in the back of the pantry in 2100 BCE and forgot. Hard as stone, a little lopsided, faintly resembling a burnt muffin, but still recognizable as bread. Archaeologists, being the brave people they are, have of course tried to figure out the recipes, which leads us to experimental archaeology. Let's try to bake it again. And so, experimental archaeologists began grinding emmer wheat on replica querns. They kneaded dough with sand-dusted fingers. They shaped the loaves like the ones found in tombs. They built clay cone ovens like the ones sketched in reliefs. And then, they baked. What came out? Well, let's just say the reviews were mixed. Most descriptions sound like someone politely pretending a terrible baked good has character. Words like robust, rustic, dense, and unforgiving get used a lot. And yes, there is still sand, because authenticity. But some batches turned out surprisingly pleasant. Nutty, a little earthy, not too different from very whole-grain bread today. And there's something weirdly soothing about imagining a group of archaeologists standing in a windy desert courtyard, blinking smoke out of their eyes, and calmly saying things like, needs more fermentation time. It's almost meditative. Bread as magic. Feeding the Ka. To understand why bread mattered so much in tombs, you need to understand the Egyptian soul, or souls plural, because they believed you had several: the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, and a few others that have names straight from a metaphysical customer service manual. The important one for bread is the Ka. The Ka was like your spiritual twin. It needed food. It needed drink. It needed comfort. If the Ka didn't get offerings, it didn't thrive. And then the afterlife got awkward. So, families brought loaves to tombs, priests performed rituals, servants lit incense, and the carvings ensured that even when human offerings stopped, the magical ones continued forever. Bread wasn't symbolic, it was literally nourishment for the soul. Your cosmic pantry needed to stay stocked. And for that, the tomb walls became eternal kitchens. Carvings of bakers, the original Michelin star staff. If you've ever looked at tomb art, you'll notice something. The bakers always look calm, focused, very upright posture for people kneading dough all day. You can practically hear the quiet hum of their routine. There's something incredibly peaceful about these scenes. Rows of workers grinding grain, hands shaping loaves, priests arranging offerings, baskets filled with bread shaped like pyramidal cones. Everything is orderly. Everything is steady. Everything is slow. And that's intentional. Egyptians believed that the afterlife should mirror the best parts of earthly life. Not the loud parts, not the stressful parts, the predictable, comforting parts. And nothing was more comforting than bread being prepared just as it always was. The offering lists. The ultimate grocery receipt. Inside many tombs, scribes carved offering lists, like menus for eternity. These lists included bread, beer, onions, fruit, cakes, oils, fowl, water, incense. But bread almost always sits at the top. There are even different categories: upper bread, lower bread, fine bread, festival bread, daily bread. If it had flour in it, the Egyptians cataloged it. This level of organization is stunning. Imagine being so committed to meal planning that you create a stone-engraved permanent shopping list for your next 1,000 years. It's charming and also very relatable. Replica utensils, because you might need to cook in the afterlife. Another fun detail is the burial of miniature tools. Little grinders, little kneading boards, little baking molds, little pots shaped like the ones bakers used every day, all made in charmingly tiny sizes, like ancient Egyptian dollhouse accessories. The symbolism is simple. Your ka might want to make its own bread. Why should it have to borrow someone else's oven? It's like ancient etiquette. Bring your own tools. Some tombs even included full-size tools if the deceased was a noble responsible for provisioning. Not that the noble ever personally kneaded dough, but it was the thought that counted. And the symbolism mattered. You take with you the roles you held in life. You take with you the tools that define your identity. Eternal recipes. What the loaves tell us. Now, let's talk about the bread itself. Ancient Egyptian loaves found in tombs come in a surprising range of shapes. Conical loaves, round buns, tall cylinder loaves, flatbreads, cakes shaped like triangles, festival loaves stamped with patterns. Some had seeds baked in. Some had sweeteners like dates or honey. If you're still awake after 3 whole parts of ancient Egyptian grinding, kneading, and general sand-related suffering, congratulations, you're basically an honorary baker now. Go get yourself a glass of water. Or, some barley beer if you want to stay historically immersive. Now, let's drift into the 4th and final stretch of tonight's cozy little trip through ancient Egypt. We're moving up in the world. Way up. Past the clay ovens and grinding stones, past the sweaty bakery courtyards where people are basically exfoliating themselves against stone querns all morning, we're heading into the quiet, shaded spaces of middle-class luxury, the scribes, the bureaucratic sweethearts of the Nile Valley. Because if being a baker was dusty, loud, and involved a lot of elbow grease, being a scribe was the opposite. More sitting, more thinking, more snacking, and, naturally, a whole lot more judging everyone else for not being able to read. So let's just float into that world. A breeze through linen curtains. Imagine a small courtyard villa. Nothing royal, nothing overly fancy, but still nice enough that you realize the person living here hasn't manually ground grain in at least ever. The doorway is draped in linen. There's a little fountain or water basin in the center because evaporative cooling was the ancient equivalent of I have air conditioning and you don't. Someone is lounging with a reed pen behind their ear like they're starring in the world's earliest office comedy. This is your average scribe in the New Kingdom or Middle Kingdom. Pick your century, they're all equally confident that literacy gives them moral superiority. For a scribe, food was less about survival and more about pacing their workday. Breakfast wasn't rushed. Meals were spaced out. Everything was eaten sitting down, preferably in the shade, preferably with someone fanning nearby. Not a life of extreme riches, but definitely a step above the whole dust and dough under your fingernails lifestyle. Bread, but better. So what did these scribes actually eat? Well, still bread. Nobody escapes bread in Egypt. But the quality was different. We're talking softer loaves, finer flour, less grit, which meant fewer dental tragedies. Their bread might even be flavored, things like dates, herbs, or sesame. It's a difference between store-brand discount white bread and the fancy bakery loaf with the pretentious label that says something like handcrafted by someone named Rowan. And unlike our poor bakers who had to chew around sand grains and pretend it was normal, scribes enjoyed smoother textures and even shapes. Ring-shaped loaves, triangular loaves, molded loaves shaped like animals, because nothing says, I'm educated like eating a duck-shaped pastry for lunch. Honey cakes, the ancient Egyptian cupcake. Now let's talk honey cakes. These little treats show up everywhere, in offerings, in elite kitchens, in temple inventories, and in the dreams of tired farmers who definitely couldn't afford them. For scribes, honey cakes were the go-to snack during long writing sessions. Imagine taking a break from drafting a list of cattle offerings just to enjoy something sweet and sticky. They were probably small, fried or baked, and sweetened with honey or date syrup, sometimes flavored with figs, sometimes fancy enough to serve to guests you wanted to impress. Basically, taste, somewhere between donut and muffin. Function, the ancient equivalent of office pastries. Experience, absolutely guaranteed to get crumbs inside your papyrus. And yes, they absolutely had breakfast pastries before pyramids had door hinges. Beer, because hydration was a suggestion. Moving along to beer, Egypt's favorite beverage by far. Everyone drank beer. Kids drank it. Farmers drank it. Priests drank it. Even the gods got imaginary beer in offerings. But scribes? They had the slightly fancier versions. Instead of the thick porridge-like stuff workers slurp down on construction sites, scribes preferred lighter brews, better filtered, finer grain, less sediment, still not exactly like a crisp lager, but definitely closer to drinkable and further than liquid bread that looked like someone blended soup with guilt. It eased the heat. It softened the bread. It also made reading long grain tax records moderately tolerable, which was essential. And since beer was calorie-dense, a scribe could basically call it lunch and feel no shame whatsoever. It was the original meal replacement shake, just slightly more intoxicating. The quiet luxury of shade. Let's float a little deeper. Imagine a scribe's midday meal. There's a stone or wooden bench, some mats, a low table, bowls of dates and figs, a jug of beer sweating slightly in the heat, and a platter of bread that doesn't feel like chewing a gravel driveway. There might even be fish, grilled or dried, or a little bit of meat if there'd been a festival recently. But the atmosphere is slow, quiet, heavy with the sense that absolutely nothing urgent is happening. Because scribes didn't work at the frantic pace we do today. There were no deadlines marked in red. No one was sending them papyrus scrolls in all caps saying, "Urgent, please review by noon." A busy day for a scribe was probably something like write a tax record, tell a trainee to stop chewing on his reed pen, eat a honey cake, get distracted by a passing cat, write a list of grain rations, take a nap, call it productivity. And honestly, good for them. Papyrus chatter. One of my personal favorite things about scribes is their attitude. We've left behind so many notes, scribbles, jokes, and passive-aggressive student exercises that we can basically hear them talking across the centuries. And trust me, they had opinions. We found training texts where the teacher basically says, if you don't become a scribe, you'll end up smelling like a swamp and regretting all your life choices. Very motivational. Very positive workplace culture. But while they weren't busy verbally dragging every other profession, scribes also liked to socialize. Meals were often shared with colleagues. Discussions ranged from temple gossip to trade numbers to "did you see what the priest wore yesterday?" All of this happened during slow, relaxed meals full of dipping bread into stews, nibbling on fruits, and sipping beer with the casual energy of someone who definitely knows where the bureaucratic skeletons are buried. a meal for the bookworms. If you were visiting a scribe for a midday break, here's what you might see on the food spread. Soft white bread, round barley loaves, cheese, the spreadable early farmers kind, dates and figs, melon if the season was kind, vegetable stews with lentils or onions, honey cakes that smelled warm and caramelized, beer in ceramic jugs, and occasionally a little bit of fish, grilled simply and served with herbs. Nothing extravagant, but everything just a tad nicer, smoother or sweeter than the average Egyptian would ever get on a weekday. It's the difference between necessary food and comfort food. And scribes were absolutely in the comfort category. The quiet power of knowing things. You might wonder, why did scribes get such cushy meals? The answer is simple. They were educated, and education, especially the ability to read, was rare enough that it came with perks. Writing was a sacred art. It recorded offerings, taxes, prayers, rituals, royal edicts. Without scribes, the kingdom basically fell apart. So people fed them well to keep them sharp and content. You wouldn't want your tax accountant getting cranky and miscalculating your grain tithes. A fed scribe was a happy scribe. And a happy scribe was less likely to add an extra donation line to your records. Shade, linen, and the scribe aesthetic. Let's pause again. Float a little. Picture the vibe. Loose linen robes, smooth papyrus sheets, ink palettes with red and black pigments, a gentle breeze from a courtyard window, a bowl of dates within arm's reach. Everything calm, unhurried, bathed in warm sunlight but softened by shade. Scribes lived in a world where thinking counted as working, and eating was done slowly enough to feel like a small ceremony. Compared to the early morning chaos of the bakeries, this was practically a spa-like treat. Food as status. Here's something fun. Scribes didn't just eat better, they also ate more symbolically. While a baker's food was fuel, a scribe's food signaled, "I am a person with mental labor to do, please respect the snacks." A scribe's diet literally reinforced his status. Soft bread meant he didn't do physical labor. Honey cakes meant he was close enough to power to enjoy small luxuries. Beer meant he was participating in elite daily rhythms, not worker rations. Food became a quiet language, a subtle reminder that scribes were the ones who kept Egypt's memory alive. It was less like, "Look at me eating this fancy cake," and more, "I'm part of the system and the system feeds me accordingly." Afternoon calm. By late afternoon, a scribe might take another break. Yes, another one, because the sun was high, the shade was nice, and honestly, who wants to write in 40 degrees Celsius? He might refresh with cool water stored in porous jars, or nibble on grapes, or share some bread with a colleague. And eventually, after hours of slow-paced work and equally slow-paced meals, he'd pack up his reed pens. If you're settling in even deeper under the blankets, perfect. Because Part 5 is where ancient Egypt slows all the way down, drifting into the soft, dusty dusk of a world lit only by oil lamps and cooling ovens. We've talked about mornings with the bakers. We've wandered through temples and tombs. We've lounged with scribes in their breezy courtyards. But tonight, let's glide into the gentle, half-forgotten rhythm of evenings in ancient Egypt, where the heat finally releases its grip, bread finishes baking, and the whole city exhales. Nothing fast, nothing dramatic, just the slow settling of life along the Nile. As the sun falls behind the clay walls, picture this: the sky fading into a dusty gold, turning lavender, then melting into a deep, smoky blue, the kind of color that makes you sleepy just looking at it. You hear distant voices, soft, not rushed, People calling to each other as they pack up baskets, wash clay cots, or gather their animals. The bakeries, which were roaring all morning, have quieted. The grindstones are covered. The ovens are still warm, but no longer blazing. Just a soft, radiating heat, like the earth itself is sighing. And in the homes nearby, the smell of bread lingers, mixing with the scent of onions frying in little clay bowls over small fires. Nothing urgent, nothing chaotic, just the steady, timeless beat of a civilization wrapping up its day. Bakers and their gentle evenings. It might surprise you, but bakers didn't work non-stop until collapse. Well, okay, they mostly did, but evenings were the one time they slowed down. A baker might sit outside on a low stool, letting his hands relax after shaping dough since dawn. He might watch customers come pick up their evening loaves, warm, fragrant, and wrapped in linen cloth. He'd chat, trade bits of news, complain gently about the sandstorm that morning, laugh about the flour shortage that seems to happen every year like clockwork. Bakers didn't get prestige. They didn't get fine linen or endless honey cakes. But they did get community. People came to them, talked to them, relied on them. And in the slow dusk hours, that counted for a lot. Scribes finishing their scrolls. Meanwhile, the scribes, still full of their honey cakes and intellectual superiority, are finishing their work for the day. They might be rolling up papyrus scrolls, smoothing the edges, letting the ink dry. Ink that smells faintly of resin and earth, mixed and stored in little ceramic pallets. There's no urgency. Scribes weren't paid to rush. They were paid to do things properly, which is ancient Egyptian for, "We'll get to it tomorrow if the gods are willing." Sometimes a student would still be practicing late, copying line after line, trying to keep his handwriting straight while his teacher half-napped next to him. The papyrus crackles softly. Reed pens scratch gently. It's soothing, almost like rain. If rain were dry and made of plant fibers. Ancient Egypt didn't have weather drama, but they did have slow, scratchy ambiance. Dinner for the everyday Egyptian. Most families gathered around simple dinners, nothing elaborate, nothing scrawled in royal inscriptions, but still comfortingly predictable. Bowls of lentils, fresh bread, occasional fish or vegetables, depending on the season, a jug of beer that was more nourishing than exciting. Kids might chase each other in the courtyard. Dogs might wander in sniffing for scraps. A cat might jump onto someone's lap, pretending it accidentally showed up at dinner time. These tiny domestic scenes never make it into museum exhibitions, but they were the real pulse of the Nile Valley. It wasn't a world of constant pharaohs and wars. Most of the time, it was people talking about the price of barley and trying to get their kids to stop poking scorpions with sticks. Night markets were a gentle murmur. You might imagine night markets as loud and bustling, but in Egypt they were surprisingly calm. By evening, people were tired. Heat drained ambition, and oil lamps cost effort to maintain. So night markets were soft, quiet chatter, a few vendors still out, selling dried fish or leftover produce, someone offering spices or herbs, things that smelled nicer once the sun wasn't scorching them. For city dwellers, these markets were a place to wind down, pick up something fresh, hear a rumor, learn who got promoted, who messed up an offering ritual, or who was spotted arguing with their donkey in the middle of the street. Even small gossip traveled slow and sticky in the warm night air. animals settling in. Ancient Egypt was full of animals, working animals, sacred animals, pets, and the entirely chaotic category of creatures we tolerate because they help. As night fell, donkeys shifted into their pens, goats bleated in that soft, complaining way goats always do. Geese honked with the confidence of animals who believed they were security guards. Cats slinked around like they were inspecting the night shift, and cattle settled into their stalls, tails flicking lazily. There's something endlessly soothing about this. A world where everything, even the animals, understood the schedule. Daytime was for noise, nighttime was for quiet. Ancient Egypt didn't do nightlife. It did slow life. The Nile at twilight. Let's float, literally, toward the river. The Nile at night wasn't empty. Boats still drifted quietly, especially ones carrying goods or fishermen bringing in late catches. Torches flickered on the decks. Water slapped softly against the wooden hulls. Sometimes a boatman hummed a tune, low, repetitive, almost hypnotic. And the river itself became a mirror, reflecting temple pylons, reflecting distant stars, reflecting palm trees swaying just a little in the cooler night air. You can almost feel the breeze, slow and gentle after a long day of thick heat. It was the kind of air that made you forgive the sun for trying to kill you earlier in the afternoon. Temples glowing at night. Temples didn't shut down. The gods never slept, or at least their priests pretended they didn't. At night, priests performed small rituals, lighting lamps, preparing incense, reciting soft prayers. You can imagine the glow of oil lamps spilling across carved hieroglyphs, shadows stretching across the columns, the faint smell of myrrh drifting like a warm cloud. This wasn't dramatic. There were no thundering gongs, no intense choirs, just slow, methodical ritual. The same motions repeated for centuries, like a cosmic bedtime routine. Even the gods appreciated winding down, at least symbolically. Night work in the bakeries. While many bakers rested, a few worked the late shift. Not because they enjoyed the heat, no sane person enjoys standing next to a clay oven at midnight, but because Egyptians loved fresh morning bread. So, some shifts began before dawn, which means, well, someone had to prepare the dough overnight. You would hear soft kneading, occasional yawns, the thump of someone patting dough into shape. No loud talking, just the quiet rhythm of hands shaping food for the next day's workers and priests. Even here, in the hottest job around, nighttime was gentler. Still warm, but bearable. Still work, but calmer. It was the closest bakers came to peace. Scribes finishing for tomorrow. Back in their homes, scribes sometimes prepared materials for the next day, cutting papyrus strips, soaking them, laying them out to dry. Their houses would smell faintly of wet reeds, their tables cluttered with ink pots. A scribe might plan what records he'd copy next: taxes, offerings, letters, school texts. Maybe a poem, maybe a hymn. He would do this slowly, maybe sipping the last of his beer, stretching out his legs, complaining about a sore back like all desk workers do in every era. And then eventually, he would stop. If you're drifting in that nice floaty state between awake and asleep, perfect. Because part 6 is basically ancient Egypt's soothing answer to the question, what do you give a god who already has everything? And the answer, of course, is bread. Always bread. forever bread. The gods were basically gluten enthusiasts with eternal appetites. Tonight, we're wandering into the quiet, sacred side of Egyptian baking. Temples, offerings, ceremonial loaves, and the bakery workshops carved right into religious complexes. No drama, just flour, fire, and divinity. Bread as cosmic order. Let's ease into this. In Egypt, bread wasn't just food. It was order, the physical form of ma'at, the universe running correctly. A well-fed god meant a satisfied god. A satisfied god kept the Nile flooding at the right time, the sun rising on schedule, and scorpions staying mostly where they belonged. So giving the gods bread wasn't optional. It was a daily responsibility. Every temple offered it, every priest supervised it, and every loaf was made to a ritual standard so specific that even the gods were probably rolling their eyes like, yes, yes, it's symbolic, just put it on the altar. Egyptians fed their gods the way people today feed houseplants, carefully, regularly, and with the belief that everything depends on it. Temple bakeries, the sacred sweatshops. Now let's float into a temple complex. Not the grand outer walls or the towering pylons, those come later. We're slipping behind the scenes into the temple bakery. And yes, it's hot. Clay ovens heat everything. There's flour dust in the air, catching the light from small oil lamps. Priests and workers move methodically, almost silently, shaping dozens of loaves. But this isn't a chaotic street bakery. This is sacred work. Calm, precise, repetitive, meditative even. Every loaf has a purpose, a ritual slot, a symbolic meaning. Temple bakery workshops were entire rooms dedicated to grinding grain, forming dough, drying loaves, and recording exactly what was made. Scribes stood nearby, writing down each offering, like accountants for the divine. Imagine a divine spreadsheet, but made of papyrus. Row 1, sun god, 6 round loaves, 4 conical loaves, 1 sweet cake. Row 2, afterlife god, similar order, but with a side of incense. It all had to be perfect, because you don't shortchange a god, even gently. Ritual loaves. The shapes matter. Egyptians didn't just offer random bread. They made specific shapes for specific rituals. Let's drift through a few. Conical loaves, the classic temple bread, sometimes baked upright in pots. Round loaves, basic, symbolic of completeness. Triangular loaves, associated with offerings of stability. Animal-shaped loaves, because the gods like thematic snacks. Tall cylindrical loaves, often used in funerary offerings. Each shape carried meaning. Each loaf represented part of the cosmic order. A temple wasn't just feeding a deity, it was reenacting creation, one loaf at a time. Offerings at dawn, the slow divine breakfast. Now, imagine the earliest priests arriving before dawn, before the city wakes, before even the bakers in town light their fires. The temple is vast, silent, and cool. Stars still faint overhead. The first ritual of the day is the opening of the shrine, which includes presenting food, including freshly baked bread. The priests move slowly, unhurried. They speak prayers in a soft rhythm that matches the slow waft of incense. Then they place loaves on the altars, often in neat rows or symmetrical arrangements. Picture dozens of warm breads sitting in the flickering lamplight, steam rising off them like quiet offerings into the air. This wasn't a feast, it was a devotional meditation. The gods didn't eat the bread physically, they consumed its essence. After the ritual, the priests would take the physical loaves away and distribute them among the staff. Nothing wasted. Spiritual efficiency at its finest. Holy gluten, the bread of festivals. Festivals were the rare times Egyptians actually got excited, but even then, things stayed surprisingly calm. During festivals, temple bakeries produced massive quantities of bread, not for frantic street fairs, but for ritual processions, priestly meals, and offerings that filled entire tables. Imagine loaves stacked like miniature pyramids, cakes glazed with honey or beer syrup, bread shaped into symbols of gods and goddesses. The aroma alone must have been heavenly. Warm yeast, toasted grains, sweet honey drifting through the air. Festival loaves were sometimes bigger, sweeter, decorated, or baked with herbs or dates. But still, everything had symbolic meaning. Egyptians did not do randomly fancy. It was always thoughtful, always ritualistic, always gently ordered. The priestly diet. Holier, softer, and better. Let's take a calm little stroll toward the priests themselves. Their food was sacred by association. They ate what the gods didn't consume, which meant they ate the best bread in the kingdom day after day. Soft, fine flour, fresh every morning. Varieties most people never tasted. If bakers fed the people, temple bakeries fed the priests, and the priests lived comfortably because the gods had great taste. But priests weren't snacking all day. Their meals were structured, timely, often vegetarian, and always infused with a quiet ritual significance. Eating was part of the temple schedule, not an afterthought. Bread was a continuation of worship, a daily reminder that they were sustaining cosmic order with each bite. Bread in myth, the godly carb load. Bread appears everywhere in Egyptian myth. It's in stories about creation, offerings, kingship, funerary rites. It's basically the spiritual glue holding the universe together. The gods ate bread as part of their existence, not literally, but symbolically, absorbing the nourishing order humans offered them. Some myths described divine bakeries in the heavens, cosmic ovens, celestial loaves rising with the dawn. Very cozy imagery for one of the oldest religions. Bread and the pharaoh, breakfast with divinity. Pharaohs weren't just political leaders, they were semi-divine. So naturally, they also got bread shaped by ritual rules. Pharaohs were offered conical loaves, ceremonial sweetbreads, pastries drizzled with date syrup, and bread baked with herbs or nuts during festivals. These weren't indulgences, they were part of maintaining ma'at. If the king was well fed, symbolically, the world stayed in balance. It's funny. In a culture obsessed with cosmic order, breakfast was basically the anchor of universal stability. Bread in funerary ritual, feeding eternity. Let's drift into tombs now, quietly, like soft wind brushing past limestone. Inside, you always find scenes of offering, rows of bread, jugs of beer, platters of vegetables, sometimes entire bakery scenes carved into the walls. Why? Because the dead needed to eat. Forever. The offering scenes were like eternal grocery lists. Bread carvings represented real bread for the afterlife. Symbolic magic at work. People even left real bread inside tombs, often petrified now, but still shaped just like the loaf that came out of the oven the day the tomb sealed. The afterlife was imagined as an endless feast. Unlimited bread, unlimited beer, unlimited comfort. A cosmic all-you-can-eat buffet. Very soothing. Very Egyptian. Experimental archaeology. rediscovering ancient loaves. Modern archaeologists, being their lovable nerds that they are, have recreated these loaves. Very calmly, very scientifically. They ground ancient grains, mixed dough by hand, shaped it according to tomb carvings, and baked it in replica clay ovens, and, yes, ate it. The results? Nutty flavor, dense texture, surprisingly delicious, still full of grainy bits that would probably ruin your dentist's mood. It's oddly soothing. We're staying with the elites a little longer tonight because their lifestyle is kind of perfect for a sleep-inducing monologue. Nothing really happens. No one rushes anywhere. People talk. People write things down. People snack. People complain about the temperature. It is, in many ways, the first great bureaucratic spa. And honestly, same. So let's ease into a slow, gentle glide through the rest of elite mealtime rhythms and the small comforts that made their days feel a little more tolerable. Egypt was hot, dusty, and crowded in the wrong places. So being rich wasn't just about food or jewelry. It was really about escape from discomfort. Shade was currency. Breeze was prestige. And linen was basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of choosing the cooling mattress topper on Amazon. Let's float into their world for a bit. The scribes, as we mentioned, were the darlings of the bureaucracy. They had access to writing materials, and that alone made everyone treat them with a kind of reverence, or at least with a carefully managed, please don't ruin my life with paperwork energy. Once you can write taxes down, you hold the entire economy hostage in a very polite, linen-wrapped way. And because their job required extreme focus, they were often given perks. One of these perks? Pretty decent lunches. Their midday meals weren't dramatic. No formal feasts, no big ceremonies. Just steady, predictable food meant to keep them fed, but not sleepy. Egypt was big on practical dining. You didn't want to fall asleep on duty and accidentally reassign a cow to the wrong farmer. That's the kind of clerical mistake that leads to lifelong curses or at least a very awkward apology scroll. So scribes usually ate more bread than was probably medically advisable, fresh cucumbers, hydration disguised as food, onions that absolutely guaranteed no one had pleasant breath, a bit of fruit if supplies allowed, and sometimes a mild, watered-down beer that technically counted as a nutrient delivery system. Luxury at this level wasn't about exotic ingredients. It was about the setting. Scribes got to sit under canopies, porticos, or simple cloth shades that took the edge off the sun. The average worker, well, they were out there slow roasting. Shade wasn't glamorous to depict, so you don't see it illustrated in tomb art much, but oh, it mattered. A shaded lunch spot in ancient Egypt was like the VIP lounge at the airport. It meant that you had enough status to not dehydrate yourself into oblivion before the age of 22. And then there was linen. Egyptian linen was famously fine, soft, breathable, smooth enough that even the Greeks were like, okay, that's actually impressive. The elite scribes wore thin, beautifully woven linen that fluttered lightly when they walked. Meanwhile, the average laborer was in something closer to a coarse, sweat-absorbing potato sack, which did the job but didn't exactly scream elegant. So when scribes sat at their low tables, nibbling on honey cakes and speaking softly about temple inventories and grain tallies, they did it while wrapped in breezy, cool fabric that made the entire world feel slightly less oppressive. This was luxury. Not the kingly version. That involved gold sandals and servants fanning you like an overripe grape, but the quiet, office worker variety. It's comforting. It's small. It's almost soothing to imagine. Just picture a scribe leaning over papyrus, reed pen in hand, the smell of ink mixing with warm bread, his linen sleeves rustling gently in the afternoon air. It's the kind of detail ancient Egyptians would have found deeply satisfying, the same way you or I feel mildly euphoric when we finally find a seat in the shade on a blistering summer day. Now, one thing that scribes loved was conversation, endless conversation. Not dramatic gossip, though they probably indulged in that too, but quiet chatter about daily workings. Someone would say something like, "Did you see the grain count from the West Granary?" "Oh yes, about 3 sacks less than expected." Probably mice." "Mice again?" "Yes, it's always mice." That was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of small talk about printer issues at the office. And of course, they snacked during this administrative symphony of mild irritations. Honey cakes were a particular favorite. Dense, comforting, filling, not too sweet, but sweet enough that you felt slightly spoiled. Honey was expensive, though, so the cakes told you someone was important, but not super important. A pharaoh got honey by the jar. A scribe got it baked into carbohydrates, which honestly sounds nicer. But here's the thing, all of these little comforts, from shade to linen to mildly fancy bread, existed because the entire system depended on scribes functioning like well-oiled hieroglyph-writing machines. The whole empire ran on written orders and records. If a scribe fainted from heat exhaustion, well, that slowed the tax cycle, and nobody wanted that. They needed these people to stay alert and alive. So lunch breaks were sacred. Hydration was strategic. Comfort was a state policy. Let's drift now into afternoons, the slowest part of a scribe's day, and therefore the slowest part of our story. By mid-afternoon, the sun had usually reached its "I could melt stone if I wanted" phase, and the scribes would settle deeper into whatever shade they'd claimed. They'd often work steadily, but calmly, the heat enforcing a natural quiet. Reed pens scratched gently against papyrus. Small breezes stirred dust into lazy spirals. Someone somewhere sighed longingly at the idea of the Nile being only slightly less warm than the air. A colleague shuffled in with a tray of more bread and beer because hydration was basically a national emergency. It was peaceful in that very specific, half-drowsy way that administrative spaces get during hot afternoons. Now, of course, scribes weren't top-tier elites. They were middle-level elites. Enough status to be respected, but not enough to boss around absolutely everyone. So their lunches weren't the wild banquet scenes we see in frescoes. Those were for the upper nobility. But scribes did occasionally get to attend those feasts. And when they did, oh, the sensory contrast must have been glorious. Suddenly, instead of grain bread, you have soft buns drizzled with honey. Instead of watery beer, you get something a little stronger, maybe spiced or filtered. Instead of onions, you get figs and dates and, if the host was feeling generous, imported delicacies that arrived on boats pretending to be tribute. And instead of quiet papyrus chatter, you get musicians plucking at strings, dancers moving slowly in the glow of oil lamps, and the soft rustle of expensive linen everywhere. For a scribe, this was the equivalent of being invited to the company executive's private holiday dinner. You were there because you were useful, not because you were glamorous. But still, free food. The comfort of elite dining wasn't actually the food. It was the atmosphere. Elite meals were rituals of relaxation. People reclined. They took their time. They chatted in languid tones. They avoided anything resembling urgency. And honestly, that's where ancient Egyptian aristocratic life hit peak sleep-inducing serenity. Because now we're going to float into something that the Egyptians took very seriously, despite their very chill outward vibe, the sacred side of food, which honestly is kind of relatable. Some of us treat our morning coffee like a religious experience too. In Egypt, though, it really was one. Food wasn't just fuel. It wasn't just an economic unit. It wasn't even just a marker of social status. It was a kind of spiritual bridge between the mortal world and whatever waited beyond it. And that means the kitchen, especially the baker's corner of the kitchen, had a little halo above it. Not a shiny gold one, more like a dusty, flour-coated halo that smelled faintly of yeast. Let's ease ourselves into that idea for a moment. Imagine being a baker in ancient Egypt. You're up before dawn, your workshop is warm from yesterday's embers, your grinding stones are waiting, your jars of emmer wheat and barley are humming with the potential of breakfast. You start your day with a tiny ritual, not elaborate, not dramatic, but just a quiet acknowledgement that bread is sacred. It feeds the gods in temples, it feeds the dead in tombs, and it feeds absolutely everyone who needs to get through another day without collapsing into the sand. Bread is life. Bread is duty. Bread is bureaucracy in edible form. And because bread is sacred, making it is sacred too. You weren't just a baker, you were a caretaker of cosmic stability. A very sweaty caretaker, but still. By the time we get to the Middle and New Kingdom periods, which is where we're gliding now, every major temple complex had multiple rooms dedicated purely to food preparation. And not just any food, ritual food, ceremonial meals, offerings. If the temple was an enormous spiritual machine that kept the whole universe running, the kitchens were the gears. They weren't glamorous. They weren't decorated like the main halls. They were functional, smoky, earthy places where dozens of workers baked hundreds of loaves every single day. The gods needed breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. And guess who provided that? Not the high priests, not the nobles, the bakers. It's always the bakers. Let's float for a moment into one of those kitchens. Don't picture a modern kitchen. No gleaming counters or copper pans. Picture something more like a cross between a cave and a pottery studio. Clay bins for grain, storage jars for beer, simple wooden boards for shaping dough, clay dome ovens glowing orange, stacks of molds for loaf after loaf, all shaped with the same precision every time. The air is thick and warm. There's a gentle crackle of low fires. Workers move in slow, practiced rhythms, turning out bread that looks exactly like what was eaten 1,000 years earlier and 1,000 years later. And despite how repetitive the job was, it carried a kind of peacefulness, the kind that comes from doing something stable, predictable, and absolutely essential. The kind of calm that lets your mind wander while your hands remember the motions. This is why bread and spirituality blended so naturally in Egypt. The work itself felt almost meditative. Now, the gods had very particular tastes, not because they were picky, but because offerings were symbolic. Bread wasn't just food, it was order. Order in shape, order in quantity, order in presentation. You didn't give a god a loaf shaped like whatever you felt like that morning. There were specific molds for specific rituals. Some breads were shaped like domes, some like cones, some like miniature pyramids, some like crescents. Some were formed using molds decorated with tiny impressions, almost like ancient cookie stamps. Imagine if every holiday cookie shape you've ever used was suddenly religiously significant. That was temple bread. And every shape had a meaning, even if we're not always sure what those meanings were, which is very ancient Egypt of them. Let's drift back toward the bakers again. Bakers were often attached directly to temple staff, which gave them a weird kind of spiritual proximity. They weren't clergy, but they worked in the spiritual engine room. They didn't interpret the god's will, but they made sure the gods didn't go hungry. And here's the truly calming part. This work never changed. For centuries, the recipe was the same. The shapes were the same. The tools were the same. The routines were the same. If you were a baker in year 10 of Hatshepsut's reign, your day looked almost identical to a baker living during the reign of Snefru, 700 years earlier. There is something extremely soothing about that. The idea that human hands kept performing the same motions across generations, grinding, kneading, shaping, baking, all while the Nile rose and fell, and kings came and went, and dynasties crumbled and reformed themselves like slightly stale dough. Now, because food was spiritual, something else interesting happens. Eating itself became a ritual of gratitude. Not dramatic, not ritualized, just polite. When a scribe sat under his shady canopy, nibbling bread and sipping beer, he wasn't just snacking because he was hungry. He was participating in a cycle that began with divine favor over the harvest, continued through farmers, bakers, transporters, temple staff, and ended with him breaking off a piece of bread in a breezy afternoon courtyard. It gave meals a quiet, grounding quality, even a humble lunch, even a crumb of barley loaf. There's a reason Egyptian art shows so many people holding bread with both hands like it's something precious. Because it kind of was.